Hello again. We're going to continue on now with some more information about bone structure. And the first thing we want to talk about are bone textures or types. This terminology, as with every unit here in biology, in anatomy and physiology, there's a lot of new terminology. So, I recommend, maybe keeping a list of words or flashcards, whatever you need to do with the new words and definitions. Start learning that sooner rather than later, because then that's going to help you understand the questions and so forth you're going to be asked, and it'll also help you understand the rest of the lecture material if you're comfortable with the new vocabulary. Okay, so bony tissues in the body can exist in two different textures or types, and one type is called compact bone. And compact bone is the dense outer layer that you have around most of the bones in the body, and we'll see more about that shortly. Compact means that the extracellular matrix of the bone is dense, tightly packed. Then there's another type of bone in the body called spongy bone. That's usually the term that I use. It can also be called cancellous bone. It's also called trabecular bone. So there are three different names for the same thing. And this type of bone actually kind of looks like a honeycomb. So it has a lot of spaces in between the hard bony parts. So it's not as dense. Compact bone doesn't have these spaces between the dense, calcified, mineralized areas that have a hard consistency. So spongy bone does look kind of spongy, or it looks like a honeycomb. And the subunits, the hardened areas, the bony areas, exist in what are called trabeculae. These are the subunits of spongy bone. Trabeculae is plural, or trabeculi. So this type of bone, trabeculae or trabeculi, are kind of T-shaped. So you have these little tiny T-shaped bony structures, and then they're arranged in these patterns, kind of like this, more or less. And then in between there, you have softer tissues that fill in those spaces. And in some bones, in some of those spaces, you have red marrow. So the softer tissue in between those little bony subunits contains these cells that are involved in manufacturing your red blood cells and your white blood cells. Now, you don't have that in every part of the body where there's spongy bone, but quite a bit of your hematopoietic tissues when you're an adult exist in these in some of the spongy bone areas of the body. Alright, so let's take a look at, here's some additional terminology if we're just kind of looking at a generic long bone. So this is we're going to have some generic long bone terminology here that we're going to go through. So again, your long bones are bones that are longer than they are wide, your arm bones, your leg bones, but even your finger bones and your toe bones, even though the bones of your hands, the bones of your feet, even though they're not particularly long lengthwise, they're longer than they are wide, so they're still classified as long bones. Alright, some terminology here. So the skinny part of a long bone in the center is called the diaphysis, and then you can see that long bones get wider on the ends, and each of those is called an epiphysis. Okay, so those are some new terms you need to know. Long bones are going to have a proximal end and a distal end, because they're part of your appendages. So the end that is closer to the trunk, the epiphysis that is closer to the trunk is going to be the proximal epiphysis. The one that is further away from the trunk of the body will be the distal epiphysis. Alright, so that's pretty straightforward. And then long bones on their ends typically have some hyaline cartilage. Alright, and it's called articular cartilage. This hyaline cartilage has that name as well in the case of the cartilage that's on the end of these long bones, because it's at locations where bones articulate or form joints with each other. So you've seen this before. The gristle on the ends of chicken bones is articular cartilage in chicken. So you have that there on the ends, like you see, drawn in there. Now if you cut open one of your long bones and looked at it in a cross section like you see here, you would notice, let's see, like over here, see how they've taken out a chunk of the epiphysis here and they've blown it up over here in more detail. Around the edges over here you have compact bones. That's very dense. You don't have a lot of spaces in between. And then in the internal portions there, that's where you have your spongy bone or your cancellous bone, your trabecular bone. So do you see you've got spaces in there, and these are these little T-shaped subunits that are called trabeculae that make up the spongy bone. Now if you come down here into the diaphysis, you've got compact bone around the edges, and then in the center, right there in the center, you have what's called the medullary cavity. Medullary cavity is another name for marrow cavity. And again, that's where the location of your bone marrow. Once you're an adult, the medullary cavities of most of these long bones in the body will be filled with the yellow type that consists of fattier tissues. But sometimes up in your spongy bone, you will have red marrow occupying those particular spaces. Let me erase all that. Go away. All right, a couple of other things I want to point out to you here. You do have a connective tissue lining, the periosteum. That is a dense connective tissue covering. On the outside of the bone. And then the medullary cavity on the inside has a connective tissue lining. And that is called the endosteum. The periosteum, if you've ever barbecued something before, like you've had barbecued ribs and maybe you've noticed that crusty stuff kind of flaking off of the surface of the bone, that's the periosteum on the ribs you were enjoying. So you can think about that the next time you have a steak or you barbecue some ribs or something. You know, take a look at that. You'll see that crusty stuff flaking off, and you can impress everybody and tell them that it's the periosteum that's flaking off of all those rib bones. I'm sure they'll be impressed that you can tell them that. All right. Moving on here. Let's see. So I think here on the text of this slide, I've just written out things that I was just talking about on the last one, so I'll just kind of bypass those. Yeah, and here's a pretty good, this is a nice picture from your textbook because it is blowing up the diaphysis portion. So here you're looking at a chunk of a diaphysis of a long bone, the shaft in the center. And so here, see how they've got labeled endosteum? They haven't really drawn it in, but there would be a really thin connective tissue lining or membrane there that's surrounding that yellow bone marrow. That's called your endosteum. The periosteum is pretty tough. I mean, it's dense connective tissue, nice tough covering. Notice it's got lots of blood vessels passing through it, so there's a pretty good blood supply to that tissue. And then also notice the bone tissue itself, the bone has a good blood supply. So bone tissue is also called osseous tissue. And it has a good blood supply. So if you remember back in Unit 2, we talked about dense, regular connective tissues that compose ligaments and tendons. You got all those protein fibers in there that are jam-packed so tightly and in parallel, there's no room for blood vessels So it has a poor blood supply. Hyaline cartilage, all of the cartilages have a poor blood supply because of the dense matrix that they have. There are no spaces for blood vessels to enter. Bone is different though. Bone, you can see the artery here actually extends into the bony tissue itself and has branches that come off of it and wind up supplying the internal parts of the bone with blood. And guess what that means with regard to healing? And if you break a bone, yes, it takes some time to heal it, but bones are capable of healing, as we all know. Bones will actually generally heal much better than a ligament or a tendon or a cartilage that winds up getting severely damaged or torn. Alright, so on this diagram here, you've got perforating, Sharpies, fibers. Don't worry so much about that. These little things that kind of look webby and stringy here, those are extensions of the periosteum that help anchor the periosteum to the underlying bone. And notice there too, you've got that compact bone along the diaphysis, along the shaft, that's very dense. It does have those holes, or those little tunnels in the center. We'll talk about that shortly. But overall, if you look at that really closely, the bony, hardened areas, you don't see spaces in there. That's very dense type of bone. Notice though too, over here on the medullary cavity, you've got that endosteum covering there, but you have a little thin area of spongy bone that lines the medullary cavity as well. And that would actually be underlined. You have the endosteum, that connective tissue covering, close to being in contact with the yellow marrow, and then if you go outward from there, you're going to hit this little thin area of spongy bone, and then you're going to move on to the compact bone as you go in this direction away from the center. Alright, some additional information there about your periosteum, that dense, fibery, connective tissue covering. This is a location where you have important cells that we'll be talking more about shortly that play huge functions in the physiology of the skeletal system. And those cells are called your osteoblasts. These are cells that actually create osseous tissue, bony tissue. They're your bone forming cells. Then you have the osteoclasts. Those are cells that actually dissolve bone, which can be important for bone shaping. It's important, as we'll see, for calcium homeostasis. Very important cells, both of those two types. And you guys are going to learn as we move through this unit that throughout your lifetime, you are constantly depositing new bone and breaking it down, depositing new bone and breaking it down. You've got this up and down bone formation, bone destruction, bone formation, bone destruction cycle that goes on, and that is important for your calcium homeostasis. That's a homeostatic mechanism that takes place. So we'll be hearing a lot about osteoblasts and osteoclasts during this unit, and unfortunately their names are very similar, so you just have to learn that osteoblasts are your bone forming cells, osteoclasts are your bone destroying cells. Just one letter separates the two names. So you have those cell types are actually there in the periosteum, in that connective tissue covering, and they can migrate to locations where they're needed for bone forming and bone destruction. And you've got another cell type in there called an osteogenic cell, and they're a type of stem cell. Stem cells are cells that have not specialized yet. They haven't taken on special functions. And we'll see what the lineage is with these cells. What do these osteogenic cells become as we move through the different topics here? The periosteum, you'll have holes that extend off of it and into the bony tissue itself. Those are called nutrient foramina. You're learning as we go through the skeletal system anatomy that foramina, that's the plural of foramen, those are holes in bones, And in the case of these long bones, those openings allow nerve fibers, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels to actually enter the bony tissues themselves. So yes, you even have to have a nerve supply to your bone, otherwise you wouldn't be able to have any sensations within the bones themselves. And as we talked a little bit about before, if you don't have nervous sensations, that's not good for survival. Imagine if your bones had no sensations, you could break them and not even realize you had broken a bone, and then you might keep using it even though it's damaged, and then it would wind up getting injured even more. So even though we hate pain, pain plays a very important role in survival and maintaining our tissues. A little bit more here about the endosteum. Again, now this is a more delicate membrane. The periosteum is a tough, fibery membrane. Endosteum is very delicate, but it's also a location where you have osteoblasts and osteoclasts hanging out so that they can be used when needed. We'll be hearing more about those guys as we move through the unit. So those are your long bone structure. Now what about the other bone types, like your short bones, your irregular bones, and your flat bones? Because they have a very different shape and structure than your long bones do. So those types of bones will still have a periosteum covered compact bone along the outer surface. And then on the inside, they're filled up with spongy bone on the inside. And spongy bone, all right, so you've got those little T-shaped structures that kind of look like this, let's say. And you've got those spaces in there. And then, oops, go away. All right, and then lining those spaces along the surface of those little T-shaped structures, you do have endosteum in these types of bones as well. And you do have the red stuff that you see there would be the bone marrow that you have, softer type. That is a type of connective tissue. It's a softer tissue occupying the spaces there in between the trabeculae or trabeculi. Spongy bone in your flat bones, like the flat bones of the skull, for example, is sometimes called diplo or diploe is another name for that you guys will see. All right, so here's a pretty nice picture from your textbook, which is actually showing some of this to you. If you cut open one of the bones of the cranium and look at it in cross section, you can see the compact bone there along the edges, and then you can see the spongy bone there in the center. Okay, and again, that spongy bone that is located in your flat bones in between those thinner layers of compact bone at the edges is called diploe. That's another name for that. And I kind of like this picture down here on the bottom because they're magnifying the trabeculae or trabeculi of the spongy bone for you, so you can see those up close and personal. And just keep in mind when you see pictures like this of real bone, bony tissue tends to last for a long time after a person dies. And so those spaces that you see there between the trabeculae and a living person are going to be filled up with softer connective marrow, connective tissue marrow, which could be, depending on where the bones are located, it might be red marrow, might be yellow marrow, depending on where that spongy bone is, and also depending on the age of the individual. All right, a little bit more about the red marrow locations, the locations of your hematopoietic tissues. So again, now in adults, you're going to find that red marrow in those trabecular cavities, those spaces between the trabeculae in the heads of the femur, and then also the humerus. Humerus is the upper arm bone. Femur, those are your thigh bones. And you also will have it in the diploe of the flat bones of the body, so sternum, and then the bones up in the skull. Now, when you're a newborn infant, you have a lot more of your marrow devoted to red marrow because you're growing. You've got to crank out lots and lots and lots of new blood cells. Everybody has to create, even as an adult, you're constantly replacing red and white blood cells, but when you're an infant, you really need a lot of space devoted to that. So when you're a newborn, the medullary cavities of your long bones and then all spaces in spongy bone throughout the body consist of red marrow, but then that converts to yellow marrow as you get older. Alright, so that was just an introduction to with some more information about bone structure. We're going to have a little short lecture next on skeletal cartilages before we wind up moving into even a little more detail on the microanatomy of our of osseous tissues.